All right, so this is a quick podcast to go over the recent shellshock bash vulnerability. If we look at my code here, essentially when you define a function, bash was not properly ignoring some code that came after the function definition. So in this case, this is code that came from the Red Hat announcement about the vulnerability. It said, "Oh, run this command to test if you are vulnerable," and if it prints vulnerable, it says you're vulnerable. So is it really a big deal that you're vulnerable? Yeah, there's a patch now, so you should apply the patch if you haven't already and you operate Linux systems. But let's pretend like we're back in the 4 or 5 days between the time when the vulnerability came out and the reliable patch was released. Is this something you need to worry about? Well, it depends on several things. Are you running any of the vectors that can be used to trick bash into running this code? Apache with CGI bin scripts enabled that were bash scripts were one of the methods for exploiting this. So if you were running Apache with CGI bin scripts, you might need to be worried. What does that mean? Well, a CGI bin script is a script that can run a command and then display the output back to the user in the browser. So in this case, I have a simple CGI bin script that essentially prints the date. Not a very exciting example, but it is what it is. So in order to exploit this with Apache, you have to have CGI bin scripts running. One of them has to be a bash script that someone can find, and then someone can run that CGI bin script, providing it with some malicious input in the form of an environment variable. We're going to use the user agent environment variable for that in a moment. And then it will execute that code that got passed to it in that environment variable. So what can you do? How do you exploit it and what can you do? Well, here is a example of something you can do. Curl is a tool that can be used to retrieve web pages. The capital A option tells it to set the user agent. I'm setting the user agent to this exploit string that essentially says, "Hey, show me the password file." Then I'm specifying the server and the whole URL to the CGI bin script. So in this case, I just ran that and I got the password file. So that's not good. Well, that's not good, but it's not really exciting, right? What else could you do? Well, you can do anything that user has access to do on the system. So if that user has permission to write to the web files where the web pages are stored for that server, you could delete those files, you could overwrite those files. Here I have an example where if we go look at the main web page for the site, oh hey, this is a web page, pretty exciting, right? I just reloaded, this is a web page. If I run this command again, I'm going to overwrite what's in the web page with "I own your web page." So if I go refresh that page, ooh, "I own your web page." I did that remotely as an unauthenticated user who does not have permission to be making changes on your server. So that's a big deal. What else can you do? Well, here's some code somebody wrote and put out on the internet, some Python code that starts a reverse shell back to your system. So in this case, I have to start my netcat listener on port 4444. I have already ran the command, so I don't have to type it in there. This basically says run the Python script. The target is blah 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 .98. Here's the path of the script I want to exploit. Here's the remote listener .10 is my system and port 4444. So this is going to run, and now if I go back to my netcat shell, I have a shell running on interactive shell running on that system as the user running the web servers. Now I can do whatever the web server can do. Whatever this guy has permissions to do on the web server, I can do it on my system. Oh, I already CD'd HTML. All right, so now I'm in the HTML. So now I could, create new files or modify files that are already there. I could, do a find to look for files that are certain things or whatever. So I can do whatever any user can do on any system. I could also download code. If we look at this example, somebody posted, they found this in their logs. Essentially, this exploit was using wget to download a executable from this IP address and then start that executable, right? Well, what's that executable do? I don't really know, but down here somebody did a tiny bit of analysis and says, looking at string variable, it appears to be a kernel exploit with a command and control component. So what does that mean? That means the server is now part of that guy's botnet. So what can you do to prevent these things from happening? Well, this particular vulnerability, you have to exploit it with Apache, you have to have mod CGI loaded, right? So it's loaded by default, but does it have to be? Well, if you're not actually using CGI scripts, you probably should not be loading CGI module. So in this case, we'll just go disable mod CGI. Restart Apache, right? So now, if I try to run it and get my password file, oh hey, now look what happened. Instead of actually executing my script, it just displayed the contents. Same thing if you go over here and click on it. It's not going to execute it anymore. Now it wants me to download the bash script instead of executing it. I'm not going to download it. So that's the easiest solution if there's no patch and you know that it requires mod CGI. If you're not using mod CGI, turn it off. Even if you are using mod CGI, what are you using it for? Is it business critical? Perhaps you could just turn it off until the patch is out and then turn it back on. How many users do you have out there for the 4 or 5 days you're waiting to get the patch? Will they be mad? How much will they be mad? Will they be mad and it costs you money, or will they just be mad? So that's something you can do to prevent it. Say, for example, it's a business critical application. You can't disable mod CGI. So what do you do then? Well, there's some other things you can do to try to protect yourself a little bit. You could, you know, one thing you could do is you could modify the firewall. Modify the firewall to not allow outbound connections. So this firewall rule set I just loaded has a output policy of accept related and established packets, reject everything else. So now if I try this shellshock Python script again, now it's still connected to the server, it still tried to exploit it, but now I can't connect out because the firewall is blocking outbound traffic. So I wasn't able to get my reverse shell. Well, so how about my, get the password file? Does that work? Oh, that still works. So yeah, so in that case, the user still can get access to stuff they shouldn't be able to get access. How can you protect against that? Well, you could have something in front of the web server protecting the web server. One of the examples in the security advisory, they gave some mod security rules. Mod security is a open source web application firewall. So you could look at the request coming in and see if that request contained these special sequence of characters, right? And then if the request contained the special sequence of characters, you could ignore it. That's probably not real effective because they could change the characters and encode it in different ways. But that's something you do that would protect you. Add some amount of protection. You could also perhaps if you wrote your scripts in Bash, you could maybe convert them to Perl or something else for the short term. What else could you do? You could change what the user has access to. So when you run this exploit, you get access as the Apache user. Well, maybe you could change the permissions in the file so that Apache doesn't have access to the right to the file. Right? My little own your web page script would not have worked if Apache did not have permission to write to the index file. So if your index file was owned by somebody else without having Apache having write permissions, that would be something you could do to prevent it. So overall, to summarize, just because you're vulnerable doesn't mean you're exploitable. But if you are vulnerable, you should still patch anyway as soon as possible.